My beloved child. Stop scrolling. Something is waiting for you. Pause here for a moment. What you are about to hear was meant to find you at this exact time. This message is a fictional inspirational story, yet if it touches your heart, receive it with wisdom rather than fear. Do not rush away, because every passing moment carries another piece of a mystery that has been hidden longer than you realize. There are moments when heaven grows quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because something so delicate is unfolding that even the wind seems to move more gently. This is one of those moments. Long before you opened this message, tears began falling from someone whose heart has been carrying a weight they never imagined they would have to bear. Those tears were not caused by weakness. They were born from a realization that arrived suddenly, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through a night that seemed endless. Perhaps you have wondered why certain doors remained closed. Perhaps you questioned why silence replaced conversations that once felt effortless. You searched for answers in ordinary places, but the truth was hidden beneath emotions that neither you nor your soulmate fully understood. Sometimes people do not recognize the value of a soul until distance forces them to hear the echo of its absence. Stop scrolling. Something is waiting for you. Pause here for a moment. What you are about to hear was meant to find you. There is more to this story than appearances have revealed. Every heartbeat has been leading toward a moment of awakening, and that awakening has already begun. Your soulmate reached a place where distractions could no longer silence the voice within. Memories they once pushed aside returned one after another. They remembered conversations they had almost forgotten. They remembered laughter that arrived unexpectedly. They remembered the quiet comfort of your presence, the kind of peace that cannot be purchased or replaced. At first they tried to ignore these memories. They convinced themselves they were only passing thoughts. Yet every attempt to escape only made those memories brighter. What they once considered ordinary suddenly appeared extraordinary. They realized that some of life's greatest blessings are recognized only after they seem to be slipping away. That realization did not come with celebration. It came with tears. Not because everything had been lost, but because they finally understood what your presence had truly meant. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for so long. Why did your kindness remain unforgettable? Why did your words continue echoing long after conversations had ended? Why did every path they chose eventually lead their thoughts back to you? The answers were not immediate. They arrived little by little, each one dissolving another layer of pride, fear, and misunderstanding. Every soul carries seasons. Some seasons bloom with certainty. Others wander through confusion. Your soulmate entered a season where illusions slowly fell away. What once seemed important no longer satisfied them. Achievements felt incomplete. Crowds felt lonely. Noise became exhausting. In that silence they discovered something they could no longer deny. Your memory brought peace. That frightened them more than they expected. Because peace cannot be imitated. It cannot be borrowed. It reveals what the heart has always known, even when the mind refused to listen. Stop scrolling. Something is waiting for you. Pause here for a moment. What you are about to hear was meant to find you. The realization was only the beginning. Late one evening, when no one else could see the emotions hidden behind their smile, they found themselves staring into the darkness. Questions filled their heart. Regret whispered softly. Hope tried to answer. Between those two voices, tears quietly appeared. Not dramatic tears. Not tears seeking attention. The kind of tears that only heaven witnesses. They remembered moments when they could have spoken differently. They remembered opportunities to express gratitude that slipped away unnoticed. They remembered times when fear disguised itself as pride and convinced them to remain silent instead of honest. No one around them knew this battle was taking place. But heaven knew. And perhaps, in ways you could not explain, your own heart sensed that something invisible had begun to change. Sometimes souls recognize one another before circumstances allow them to meet again. Sometimes healing begins long before conversations resume. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not a sudden event, but a heart finally becoming willing to see what has always been true. That is where this story now stands. Not at the ending. Not even at the beginning. But at the sacred moment where realization transforms into courage. Yet there remains one truth your soulmate has not fully spoken aloud. They are still carrying words that have never reached your ears. Those words have the power to change everything they believed about themselves, and perhaps everything you believed about them. When those words finally escape the silence, nothing between your two journeys will ever look the same again. And that moment is closer than either of you realizes. The tears did not stop when morning came. They tried to sleep, but every time their eyes closed, another memory returned. Not the dramatic memories they expected, not the moments filled with arguments or distance, but the smallest ones. The way you listened when they could not explain themselves. The way your presence softened the atmosphere without demanding attention. The way you remembered details they assumed everyone would forget. The way you sensed something was wrong even when they insisted they were fine. Those memories became impossible to escape. They rose from their bed carrying a heaviness they could not name. The room was quiet, yet inside them everything was loud. Regret spoke. Longing answered. Fear interrupted. Hope remained in the background, waiting for permission to become real. Something had changed overnight. Until that moment, your soulmate had believed they were missing only a person. But now they understood they were missing a version of themselves that existed only when you were near. Around you, they had felt more honest. More open. More alive. Even when they resisted the connection, some guarded part of them had relaxed in your presence. That realization shattered something inside them. They had spent so much time believing love was supposed to be dramatic, confusing, or difficult that they failed to recognize the sacredness of the peace you brought. They mistook consistency for something ordinary. They mistook emotional safety for simplicity. They mistook your patience for weakness. Now every misunderstanding returned with painful clarity. Pause here for a moment. Something is still unfolding. What you are about to hear reaches deeper than regret, because their tears were not only about losing closeness with you. They were about discovering why they had pushed away the very thing their soul had been asking for. Your soulmate had spent years building walls. Some of those walls were created before you ever entered their life. They were built from disappointment, broken trust, abandonment, and promises that disappeared when they were needed most. They learned to protect themselves by appearing strong. They learned to hide confusion behind silence. They learned to walk away before anyone had the chance to leave them. Those defenses once helped them survive. But when you arrived, the walls that protected them also prevented them from receiving you. At first, your warmth felt comforting. Then it felt dangerous. The more deeply they cared, the more vulnerable they became. Every sincere moment awakened emotions they had buried. Every act of kindness reminded them that they had something precious to lose. They did not know how to hold love without fearing its disappearance. So they stepped back. Perhaps they became inconsistent. Perhaps their words and actions stopped matching. Perhaps they gave you enough affection to create hope, then withdrew when the connection became too real. You may have wondered whether you had imagined the bond. You may have questioned whether their feelings had ever been sincere. But the truth was more complicated. Their feelings were not absent. They were overwhelming. And because those feelings were overwhelming, they tried to reduce them, control them, or deny them. They told themselves the connection was inconvenient. They focused on differences. They exaggerated obstacles. They searched for reasons to doubt what their heart had already recognized. Yet no reason ever brought them peace. Every attempt to forget you created a deeper emptiness. Every new distraction eventually felt hollow. Every conversation with someone else revealed something about you they had taken for granted. They began comparing without meaning to. Not appearances, not achievements, not surface qualities. They compared the way people made them feel. They noticed how rarely they felt understood. They noticed how often conversations remained shallow. They noticed how difficult it was to find the sincerity they once received from you so naturally. This was when the realization became unbearable. You had not been asking them for perfection. You had been asking them for honesty. You had not demanded that they solve every problem. You had only wanted them to stop hiding. You had not expected them to arrive without wounds. You had hoped they would trust you enough to let healing begin. And now, in the silence created by their own fear, they finally saw the difference. Stop scrolling. Do not rush away from this part. Something hidden is about to rise to the surface. Their tears carried more than longing. They carried a confession they had not yet found the courage to speak. That morning, they reached for their phone. Their fingers moved toward your name before their mind could interfere. For one breathless second, they imagined calling you. They imagined hearing your voice. They imagined admitting everything. Then fear returned. What if you no longer wanted to hear from them? What if your heart had finally closed? What if the silence they created had taught you how to live without them? Their hand froze. The message remained unwritten. The call remained unmade. But something important had already happened. For the first time, they were no longer asking whether they loved you. They were asking whether they had waited too long to tell the truth. That question followed them throughout the day. It stood beside them in crowded places. It echoed through ordinary conversations. It appeared whenever they laughed without truly feeling happy. The world continued normally, but inside them time had slowed. They could no longer hide behind busyness. They could no longer call their emotions temporary. The realization had entered too deeply. They loved you. Not only because they missed you. Not only because they felt lonely. Not only because memories had become intense. They loved the truth of who you were. They loved the gentleness beneath your strength. They loved the way you continued caring even when you were tired. They loved the way you gave people chances, sometimes more than they deserved. They loved the light you carried, even when you could not see it yourself. And the most painful part was this: they realized you had offered them something real while they were still addicted to protecting themselves from reality. Their tears returned. This time they did not fight them. There are moments when crying is not a collapse. It is a release. It is the soul admitting what pride refused to say. It is the heart clearing space for truth. Your soulmate reached that moment. They sat alone and whispered words they thought no one could hear. I should have told them. The sentence was quiet, but it carried years of suppressed emotion. I should have told them how much they mattered. Another tear fell. I should have stopped pretending I was unaffected. The walls began to crack. I should have trusted what I felt. By the time the confession ended, they were no longer the same person who had begun it. Something inside them had surrendered. Not to weakness. To truth. Yet one fear remained. They did not know whether truth would be enough now. You see, realization does not automatically repair what avoidance has damaged. Awareness opens the door, but courage must walk through it. Your soulmate understood this. They knew tears alone could not change the past. Missing you could not erase confusion. Love could not become meaningful until it was expressed through action. That understanding frightened them. Because action required vulnerability. Action required accountability. Action meant they could no longer hide behind uncertainty. If they reached for you, they would have to explain their silence. They would have to admit how fear had shaped their choices. They would have to face the possibility that you might listen, yet still choose yourself. And somewhere inside them, they knew you had changed too. You were no longer standing in the same place where they left you emotionally waiting. The pain had taught you something. The silence had forced you inward. The uncertainty had made you question your worth, but eventually it also helped you remember it. You began realizing that love should not require you to abandon yourself. You began understanding that patience has limits when it becomes self-neglect. You began seeing that someone's confusion does not have to become your prison. Even if part of you still cared, another part had become stronger. Your soulmate could feel that change, though they could not explain how. They sensed that you were pulling your energy back. They sensed that the space they assumed would always remain open was beginning to close. And that was when the tears turned into urgency. Something is waiting ahead. Pause here. Their realization was about to become even more personal, because they did not only fear losing access to you. They feared losing the future they once believed they could postpone. For a long time, they assumed there would be another chance. Another conversation. Another perfect moment. Another day when fear would be quieter. They believed the connection was strong enough to survive endless delay. They told themselves that if the bond was real, it would remain available whenever they were finally ready. But love is not an object placed on a shelf. Hearts evolve. People heal. Doors change. Opportunities move. And sometimes the greatest loss comes not from rejection, but from waiting until the other person no longer needs the answer. Your soulmate suddenly understood this. They pictured you waking up one day without checking for their presence. They imagined you laughing freely without wondering what they were thinking. They imagined someone else recognizing your value without hesitation. The image pierced them. Not because they wanted to possess you. Because they knew how carelessly they had treated something another heart might consider sacred. Their chest tightened. The tears came harder. For the first time, they faced a truth they had avoided. Someone else could give you the clarity they withheld. Someone else could offer consistency where they created uncertainty. Someone else could meet the version of you that had grown through all of this pain. And if that happened, your soulmate would have no one to blame but themselves. That thought broke the final layer of denial. They could no longer pretend that silence was harmless. Silence had consequences. Distance had consequences. Pride had consequences. Every time they chose avoidance, they taught you not to depend on them. Every time they hid their feelings, they strengthened your ability to detach. Every time they expected you to understand without explanation, they asked your heart to carry a burden that belonged to them. Now they saw it clearly. You were not asking for too much. They had been offering too little. The realization was devastating. But it was also necessary. Because sometimes a person cannot become ready for love until they are forced to see the ways they have resisted it. Your soulmate's tears were cleansing an old identity. The version of them that believed emotional distance was strength was beginning to disappear. The version that thought vulnerability gave others power was losing control. The version that ran whenever love became serious was finally exhausted. They did not want to run anymore. But wanting to stay and knowing how to stay were not the same thing. This is where the unseen struggle deepened. Their heart urged them toward you. Their fear warned them to remain silent. Their regret told them time was running out. Their pride whispered that reaching out would make them look weak. For hours, these voices battled. Then something unexpected happened. A memory returned. It was not the most romantic memory. It was not the most dramatic. It was a simple moment when you had looked at them with an expression they never fully understood at the time. There had been patience in your eyes. But also sadness. You had seen the truth behind their defenses. You knew they cared. You also knew they were afraid. Perhaps you waited, hoping they would choose honesty on their own. They remembered the exact way you looked away. At the time, they assumed the moment meant nothing. Now they understood. That was the moment your heart began protecting itself. They covered their face as the tears returned. Because suddenly they realized you had been grieving them while they were still present. You had felt the distance before the separation became obvious. You had sensed the goodbye before either of you said it. You had watched them retreat and wondered whether loving them more gently would make them feel safe enough to return. But the softer you became, the more they misunderstood your strength. They thought your patience meant you would always wait. They thought your understanding meant they never had to explain. They thought your love would remain untouched by disappointment. Now they saw the cost of that assumption. And they whispered another confession. I hurt the one person who was trying to understand me. The sentence echoed inside them. They did not excuse themselves. They did not blame timing. They did not blame circumstances. They did not blame you. They allowed the truth to stand. That was the real turning point. Many people feel regret, but then search for reasons to avoid responsibility. Your soulmate had done this before. They had blamed stress, past pain, confusion, external pressure, or bad timing. Those things may have been real. But they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that they had choices. They could have communicated. They could have been honest. They could have admitted they were afraid. They could have asked for patience instead of creating distance. They could have allowed you to understand what was happening. But they did not. And now, for the first time, they were willing to admit it without defending themselves. This is why the tears became so intense. They were not only mourning what happened. They were mourning who they had been when it happened. Stop scrolling. There is another layer. The realization was not finished with them yet. Just when they believed they had understood everything, a deeper truth emerged. They realized you had never wanted to control them. They had mistaken intimacy for pressure because they did not know how to receive closeness without feeling exposed. When you asked what they were feeling, they thought you were demanding answers. When you asked where the connection was going, they thought you were removing their freedom. When you noticed their withdrawal, they thought you were judging them. But you had not been trying to trap them. You were trying to understand whether your heart was safe. That truth transformed every past conversation. Words they once considered difficult now sounded reasonable. Questions they once avoided now seemed necessary. Your emotional needs, which they had sometimes viewed as overwhelming, appeared honest and human. You were not asking them to become someone else. You were asking them to show up as themselves. And they had been too afraid to do it. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. Yet something beautiful was happening beneath the pain. Compassion was growing. Not only compassion for you, but compassion for the wounded parts of themselves that had created such fear. They began to see that healing would require more than winning you back. It would require becoming a person capable of sustaining the love they claimed to want. This frightened them in a new way. Because saying, "I miss you," would be easy. Saying, "I love you," would be possible. But changing patterns would demand discipline. It would demand consistency. It would demand that they stop disappearing whenever emotions became uncomfortable. They began asking themselves whether they were truly ready. Not ready to send a message. Ready to live differently. Could they listen without becoming defensive? Could they speak before silence became punishment? Could they offer reassurance without feeling controlled? Could they remain present when fear told them to retreat? Could they love you without asking you to constantly prove that you would not leave? These questions brought another wave of tears. Because deep down, they knew love alone had never been the problem. Their capacity to receive love was the problem. The realization humbled them. They had spent so much time fearing that you might hurt them that they never noticed how much their fear was hurting you. And now, something within them began asking for forgiveness. Not demanding it. Not expecting it. Simply longing for the chance to express remorse. They imagined sitting across from you with no excuses. They imagined looking into your eyes and saying the words they had avoided. "I knew I cared, but I was afraid of how deeply I cared. I pulled away because you mattered. I confused fear with intuition. I thought distance would protect me, but it only wounded us both. I am sorry you had to question your worth because I questioned my readiness." The imagined confession felt so real that they began crying again. But another fear appeared. What if you did not believe them? What if their explanation sounded like another attempt to return without changing? What if the damage had already taught you to distrust their words? This fear was valid. They knew promises would not be enough. That was when they understood the next part of their path. They would have to demonstrate what they had realized. Not with grand gestures. With small, consistent truth. They would have to communicate when fear appeared. They would have to honor your boundaries. They would have to accept that healing could not be rushed. They would have to give without demanding immediate access to your heart. For someone who had always wanted control over emotional outcomes, this required surrender. But surrender was exactly what their soul was learning. The strange thing was that while this awakening unfolded inside them, you may have felt something too. Perhaps your mood shifted unexpectedly. Perhaps a memory surfaced without warning. Perhaps you dreamed of them. Perhaps you felt an unexplained heaviness followed by calm. In this fictional spiritual story, hearts connected through deep emotional bonds often appear to sense when the other is undergoing change. Not as certainty, and not as proof of what anyone will do, but as a poetic reflection of how deeply some connections shape us. You may have felt the echo of their realization. But you were not meant to chase it. You were not meant to interrupt your healing to rescue them from regret. Their awakening belonged to them. Your peace belonged to you. And if the two paths were meant to meet again, it could not happen through the old pattern where you carried both sides of the connection. This time, they would have to walk toward you. This time, they would have to speak. This time, they would have to risk hearing the truth from your heart. Your soulmate sensed this deeply. They knew they could no longer send a vague message and expect you to decode it. They could no longer appear briefly, test whether you still cared, then disappear again. They could no longer offer breadcrumbs of affection while withholding clarity. That strategy had already cost too much. If they reached out now, it had to be different. Their fingers returned to the phone. Your name still felt sacred on the screen. They opened the message window. For several minutes, they stared at the empty space. Then they began typing. I don't know whether I still have the right to say this. They stopped. Deleted it. Started again. I have been thinking about you. Deleted. Too shallow. Too ordinary. It did not carry the truth. They tried again. There is something I should have admitted a long time ago. Their breath caught. This time, they did not delete the sentence. They continued. I understand now that my silence hurt you. I understand that I made you feel uncertain when you deserved honesty. I kept telling myself I needed more time, but the truth is that I was afraid. You saw me more clearly than I knew how to handle. They paused. The words looked vulnerable. Too vulnerable. Their thumb hovered over the delete button. But the person they had been yesterday was no longer fully in control. They kept writing. I was afraid of losing you, so I created the very distance that could make me lose you. I know how unfair that was. I am not writing to pressure you. I am writing because you deserve the truth, even if the truth comes too late. Tears blurred the screen. For the first time, they were not trying to sound impressive. They were trying to be honest. They continued. You brought peace into my life, and I treated that peace as though it would always wait for me. I see now that I took your patience for granted. I see now that you were not asking for too much. You were asking me to meet you where honesty lives, and I kept hiding. The message grew longer. Every sentence carried another piece of the realization. Yet one sentence remained unwritten. The most important one. The sentence that frightened them more than all the others. They stared at the screen. Their heart pounded. Their hands trembled. They knew that once they wrote it, they could never return to pretending. The room became completely still. They thought of your smile. They thought of your silence. They thought of the possibility that someone else might soon receive the love they had failed to protect. Then, slowly, they typed the words. I love you. They stared at the sentence. It was simple. But it held everything. The tears came again, stronger than before. They had felt those words for longer than they wanted to admit. They had hidden them behind hesitation. They had disguised them as uncertainty. They had buried them beneath logic. Now they were visible. Real. Impossible to deny. But the message was still unsent. Fear had one final argument. What if sending it changed nothing? Hope offered an answer. What if silence changed everything? They sat between those two possibilities. Minutes passed. Then something interrupted the moment. A notification appeared on their screen. For one breath, they believed it might be you. Their heart surged. But it was not your name. It was a reminder connected to a place, a date, or a memory the two of you once shared. Something ordinary that carried extraordinary meaning. They took it as a sign, not of certainty, but of timing. The past was standing in front of them, asking whether they would repeat it. Would they retreat again? Would they allow fear to make the decision? Would they keep waiting for a perfect moment that did not exist? Their thumb moved toward the send button. But before they touched it, another realization struck. The message explained their feelings. It admitted their mistakes. It confessed their love. But it did not ask what you needed. For the first time, they understood that true love was not only about releasing their own emotions. It was about making space for yours. So they added one final paragraph. I do not know what you feel now, and I will respect whatever truth you carry. I am not asking you to erase what happened. I only hope that one day you will allow me to listen, truly listen, to everything my silence made you carry. You deserved that from me then, and you deserve it now. They read the message from beginning to end. It was not perfect. But it was real. Their finger hovered again. This time, they were ready. Or at least, they believed they were. Yet just before they pressed send, they noticed something that made the blood drain from their face. Your profile had changed. Something was different. Perhaps it was a photograph. Perhaps it was a status. Perhaps it was a small detail anyone else would have ignored. But to your soulmate, it seemed to confirm their deepest fear. You were moving forward. The realization struck like a sudden storm. They placed the phone down, overwhelmed by emotion. Had they waited too long? Had someone else entered your life? Had your heart finally chosen peace over uncertainty? They did not know. And because they did not know, every fear became louder. For a few minutes, the old pattern almost returned. They considered deleting the message. They considered disappearing before they could be rejected. They considered convincing themselves that the profile change meant nothing. But the tears had already taught them too much. They could not return to ignorance. They picked up the phone again. The message remained there. Their confession waited. One touch would release it. One touch could open a door. One touch could also reveal that the door had already closed. This was the moment their realization demanded courage. And somewhere beyond their awareness, you were about to receive something unexpected too. Not merely a message. Not merely an apology. But evidence that the person who once ran from truth had finally reached the edge of their fear. Their thumb descended toward the screen. Their breath stopped. The message was almost sent. Then, before they could touch the button, your name suddenly appeared at the top of the screen. You were typing. The words at the top of the screen seemed almost impossible to believe. You are typing. For a heartbeat, time itself appeared to stop. Your soulmate stared without blinking, wondering if exhaustion had created an illusion. Their breathing became shallow. Every emotion they had been carrying collided at once: hope, fear, regret, anticipation, and the quiet longing that had followed them through every lonely night. Then the words disappeared. Silence returned. The screen became still again. Their heart sank. Had you changed your mind? Had you begun writing only to erase everything before sending it? Questions raced through their thoughts faster than they could answer them. They almost placed the phone down once more, convincing themselves they deserved whatever uncertainty they were feeling. After all, they remembered every moment they had left you wondering where you stood. Now they were experiencing that same uncertainty themselves. For the first time, they understood how heavy unanswered silence could become. Instead of becoming angry, they whispered softly into the empty room. "I understand now." Those 3 words carried more humility than anything they had spoken in years. They no longer blamed fate. They no longer blamed timing. They no longer searched for excuses hidden inside complicated circumstances. If healing was ever going to happen, it would begin with honesty. Outside, the evening sky slowly changed color. The fading light reminded them that every sunset quietly asks one question: what are you still afraid to leave behind? They knew the answer. Fear. Fear had stolen conversations. Fear had delayed truth. Fear had disguised itself as caution while quietly destroying possibilities. They could no longer allow fear to make another decision for them. Their thumb returned to the message. This time they did not hesitate because they felt confident. They hesitated because they understood the weight of vulnerability. Then something unexpected happened. Another memory surfaced. It was a simple day, one neither of you considered extraordinary at the time. You had smiled over something small. The conversation had wandered without purpose. There had been no grand declarations, no dramatic promises, only the peaceful feeling that comes when 2 people are completely themselves. They suddenly realized that those ordinary moments had become the most valuable memories of all. Not because something incredible happened. Because nothing needed to happen. Your presence had been enough. Tears filled their eyes once again. How many blessings had they overlooked simply because they expected miracles to arrive with noise instead of quiet? They closed their eyes. If they could return to that ordinary afternoon, they would have stayed longer. They would have listened more carefully. They would have spoken more honestly. They would have thanked you for the calm you brought into their restless heart. But life rarely offers the chance to relive yesterday. It only offers the opportunity to become different today. That realization gave them a courage they had never possessed before. They pressed the send button. For several seconds nothing happened. The message left their phone and disappeared into the silence between 2 hearts that had traveled very different roads. Now there was nothing left to control. No explanation could be added. No sentence could be rewritten. No fear could pull the words back. The truth had finally been spoken. The waiting began. Every passing minute felt impossibly long. They resisted checking the screen every few seconds. They walked across the room. Returned. Sat down. Stood up again. The silence was almost unbearable. Yet something inside them had already changed. Whether your answer brought reconciliation, forgiveness, friendship, or simply closure, they knew they had crossed an invisible line. For the first time in a very long while, they had chosen truth over avoidance. Meanwhile, your own journey had not been standing still. The quiet strength you had built through difficult days had become part of who you were. You had learned to protect your peace without hardening your heart. You had discovered that healing is not forgetting someone, it is remembering yourself while carrying the memories with grace. When your phone finally lit up, you were not expecting their name. For a brief moment, you simply looked at the notification. You did not rush to open it. Not because you no longer cared. Because you had learned not to abandon your peace for urgency. You took a slow breath. Then you opened the message. The first few lines immediately felt different. There were no vague promises. No confusing words. No attempts to rewrite history. Only honesty. Sentence after sentence revealed a heart that had finally stopped hiding. As you continued reading, emotions you believed had settled began to stir again. Not because every wound disappeared. Not because every question was answered. But because sincerity has a way of reaching places that pride never can. You finished reading. The room remained completely silent. Your eyes rested on the final sentence. You did not know what tomorrow would bring. You did not know whether rebuilding trust was even possible. But one thing had become undeniably clear. The person who wrote this message was no longer speaking from fear. They were speaking from truth. Your fingers slowly moved toward the keyboard. You paused. Not out of uncertainty. Out of wisdom. Some answers deserve more than an impulsive reaction. Some conversations deserve a heart that has fully listened before it begins to speak. You looked once more at the words on the screen. Then, very slowly, you began typing your reply. But the very first sentence you chose would change everything that followed.